We now have 2.3 million people behind bars in this country. That's more than any other nation in the world. We've got 5% of the world's population and 25% of the people behind bars. That means we're the number one jailer. That's not something we should be proud of. Right now we spend over $68 billion a year locking people up. The very bad news from that figure, other than the fact that it's absolutely enormous, is that our solution doesn't work. We've got 50, 60, 70% of people coming back to jail and prison once they leave. That means we're failing about 70% of the time. It's not just the cost to taxpayer dollars. There's a human cost, and that human cost is extremely high. We know that when we send people to prison or jail, there's a very high probability that they're going to be raped or sexually abused. We know that there's also a very high probability that the severely mentally ill, and there are many, many severely mentally ill people in prison and jail, they're not going to get the treatment they need for their health problem, and that they're probably going to be worse off when they come out of jail or prison. That's a human cost, but it's also a public safety cost. There's a lot of evidence-based data out there that tells us what we should be doing instead of what we're doing right now. One of the things that we could do tomorrow is take a look at how we treat nonviolent drug offenders. The vast majority of people in prisons and jails in this country are there for drug offenses, and they're nonviolent criminals. We know that rather than locking those people behind bars with violent criminals, what tends to work a lot better, and what is actually significantly cheaper, is community-based drug treatment. We should be focusing our precious resources on solutions that work and that cost less. We know that in prisons and jails in this country, in juvenile detention centers, sexual abuse, rape is endemic. It's a problem that's out of control. Congress recognized that in 2003, and it passed the Prison Rape Elimination Act. That act set up a national commission of experts to study the problem and make recommendations about how we eliminate this problem in our correctional facilities. They spent 5 years studying this problem. They talked to all the stakeholders. They talked to corrections officials, they talked to victims, they talked to judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys. They did a very good job. And what they came up with are some solid solutions that are also practical. They knew that corrections and that taxpayers didn't have endless supplies of money. And so they took a look at what would work and what would be cost efficient, and they came up with some recommendations. Unfortunately, those recommendations have not yet been enacted. We want the administration, the Obama administration, to take this problem seriously, to enact the PREA Commission standards. That was a bipartisan commission. They did a thoughtful job, and they gave us solutions that work. We do need to be tough on offenders, but we also need to be sensible. We need to engage in policies that work rather than that sound good on paper or in sound bites. One of the casualties of this 30 years of tough on crime without reflecting on what really works to make us safer is the broad use of long-term solitary confinement in this country. And that means locking people away for 23 hours a day without any human interaction and contact. Unfortunately, we know in the last 3 decades there's been considerable research to prove that actually when you deprive people of interaction with other human beings, they experience psychological effects, negative psychological effects. If they had mental illness before, they go crazy. We know that there are more effective ways of dealing with correctional management and cheaper ways. We've seen that in Mississippi, where they took a hard look at the 1,000 men that they had in solitary confinement, and they determined that a vast majority of them were mentally ill and needed mental health treatment, so they diverted those folks out. And then they took a look and said, are these people really violent, or are there other reasons why they're here? Did they engage in disciplinary infractions that weren't violent, that could be handled in a different manner? And they went from 1,000 men in solitary confinement to only 150. That's a huge decrease. And now the Department of Corrections head, Christopher Epps, has decided, maybe I don't really actually need a supermax. What I need is other intelligent, less expensive options. Mississippi has reformed its practices, and we hope that other states will take a look at this wonderful model.
The problem at the federal level is that there really has been very little thought given in the last 20 years to how the president's pardon power ought to be used. the administration of the power is in the Justice Department. And I think the Justice Department has had very little interest in exploring the possibilities. They have seen clemency as something that is threatening to what they do. And so they would just as soon that the president didn't do any at all. Unfortunately, the president has not had any independent interest in clemency for the past 3 administrations, 4 really. When you talk about reforms, I think the first step has to be to get the president's interest. That's the first thing. The second thing is to decide how he wants to use it, whether he wants to make some strategic use of it to send a message. This is a wonderful bully pulpit for the president to make some grants that will send a message, tell a story of sentences that are too long or unjust, of lives that have been redeemed and rehabilitated and that should be forgiven. If the president decides he wants to use the power, that's the first step. Then, as I said, deciding how he wants to use the power. Then there has to be a system that's developed to make sure that he's protected in using it. Now, for 150 years, that's been the Justice Department. There are many people who question whether the Justice Department is the right place to be investigating and processing and recommending in clemency cases. And so that is a question I think that really ought to be considered. Establishing an independent commission, perhaps with judges on it, that would be able to make recommendations to the president that would give him a degree of independence from this sort of nagging political concern. Many of the states do it that way. They have high-level boards that make recommendations to the governor. This would be one useful reform. If it does stay in the Justice Department, it needs to be elevated, given the resources, to do what the president wants it to do. I think it would be a very good idea for the president to decide to put his own appointee in charge of that program in the Justice Department. That would be a first step, and it would be a sign that the president was taking the power seriously.
In a country where we're releasing hundreds of thousands of people from prisons and jails every year, and 2/3 of them are returning within 3 years, we have to look at the problem and say, we're doing something wrong. We want people to come out and rebuild their lives, but we create barriers to employment, housing, public benefits, education, voting, and other things that help people to become included in society. It's failing because we expect people to return to society and become productive members of their communities. And rather than encouraging that, we're actually inhibiting it by creating barriers that prevent people from becoming included in their communities, becoming contributing members of society, becoming taxpayers, becoming people who use the public benefits that they're entitled to support their families, and to create the kind of foundation that will make them a more productive, contributing member of society. Over the last few decades, we've had this sort of tough on crime attitude that says that more punishment means better punishment. And so rather than letting people complete their sentences and then continue with their lives, we're creating policies that impact them in a negative way for the rest of their lives. So rather than completing their sentences and sort of repaying their debt to society, they're expected to continue to repay that debt for the rest of their lives. We're asking them to redeem themselves while at the same time withholding any hope of redemption. States have begun to realize during this financial crisis that they absolutely can't afford to continue incarcerating people at the rate that they have been. When we know that 2/3 of people who are released from prison or jail are going to return within the next 3 years, we see that as an opportunity to eliminate some of this revolving door that's happening with people returning to prison all the time after they've been released, continuing to drain correctional resources when they are expected to have been rehabilitated. And so yes, states and the federal government are realizing that this presents an opportunity to use taxpayer dollars more wisely. some states, Texas, for example, the sort of one of the tough on crime states that we always talk about, has managed to reduce its prison population while improving public safety and saving taxpayer dollars. So we know that a lot of these mechanisms that can be used to improve the chances that people will stay out of prison after they've been released not only improve communities and lives, but also save taxpayer dollars. I am optimistic. It seems really like the tide has begun to turn. Policymakers on both sides of the aisle are starting to realize that we need to take a smarter approach to this issue. We know that we can invest money in education, employment, substance use treatment, and that down the road we're saving dollars on corrections.
I agree with many Americans who say the system is broken. Before we can even determine how we fix those problems, we have to make an assessment of what is really going on. What's going on in the states? How is our criminal justice system working in terms of how we prosecute individuals? Who are the individuals that are being perhaps targeted for crimes? What kinds of crimes? What level of crimes? Until we make that kind of overall assessment, we really can't begin to fix the system. One of the things that we recommend in our Smart on Crime document is that the President, the White House, and Congress support the establishment of a National Criminal Justice Commission, a commission that would be made up of a bipartisan membership, where they would really take a look at a little bit of everything. I'd say it would be a kitchen sink kind of commission, where we would literally look at everything from sentencing to prosecutions, to stop and frisks, and everything in between. Look at the juvenile justice system, look at the disability community. How are we dealing with all of these communities? How are we meeting the needs of the average American citizen? And I think that's where we have to start. I think that, as you've pointed out, that is a driving force. I think Americans want to see that their tax dollars are being spent wisely and efficiently. And that includes how we are dealing with our criminal justice system. The other interesting thing is really the flip side to that is that Americans still overall believe in a system of fairness and justness. And even though we all believe that when individuals in this country commit crimes, they should be dealt with within our criminal justice system, I think pretty much across the board people feel as though that should be done in a fair way, that everyone should have the rights that are granted to them under our Constitution. But we would love to see Congress and the White House invest more dollars. There's a particular piece of legislation called the Justice Reinvestment Act that many are supporting, which would ensure that monies are spent wisely and correctly in terms of looking at where is the most need, how can communities be helped in the greatest way. And again, I think once people understand that the government, that Congress is trying to spend monies in such a way that they will protect communities, make them safer, I think most Americans will understand that.